She walked onto the shooting range at dawn, quiet, unassuming, invisible to most eyes. But what happened next changed everything. With no name, no ID, and a weapon few could identify, the woman hit targets at distances no one else dared attempt. When the police arrived, she didn't resist. She didn't speak. Within hours, her silence triggered a federal investigation, a classified courtroom appearance, and a revelation that stunned even the highest-ranking officials. Who was she, and why was she hiding in plain sight? This is the story of a quiet guardian, a forgotten range, and the power of invisible service. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. She didn't fight when they cuffed her, not even a flinch. No badge, no explanation, just a quiet woman, sharp-eyed, silent, taking down impossible targets without revealing a single thing about herself. The small-town courthouse had been bracing for a routine case, until that heavy door swung open. A Navy admiral, crisp in his blues, strode into the courtroom with the weight of history in his step. Every veteran in the room instinctively stood tall. The judge froze mid-sentence as her eyes scanned the sealed file just handed to her. Her hands trembled, and in a breath, everything changed. But before that moment, before the Admiral and the headlines, it all began with fog rolling over a remote civilian shooting range just off the coast of Maine. At dawn, the air was thick, the visibility low, and the world felt paused in gray silence. Then, the shooters arrived. Among them was a woman in her early 30s, black, poised, and remarkably ordinary at first glance. She wore faded jeans, a nondescript gray jacket, and a weathered baseball cap pulled low over her brow. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She walked to the farthest lane, carrying a long black case that could have held a cello, or a weapon built for precision. Frank Holden, the range's head of safety, noticed her from his office window. After 22 years in the Navy and a decade running that range, Frank had developed a sixth sense for reading people. He watched her with quiet interest. Most shooters carried themselves with bravado or tension. She moved with deliberate calm. Out on the line, the weekend warriors were already swapping gear and tactical tips. Local hunters zeroed their scopes. Off-duty cops practiced drills. But this woman, she stood apart. She unpacked a custom-built rifle with fluid ease, her movements efficient, almost ceremonial. When she loaded her first round, there was no doubt in Frank's mind this wasn't her first time behind a gun. The first shot rang out, bullseye center mass. She didn't even pause. Her breathing followed a steady 4-count rhythm. Inhale, hold. Exhale, fire. Then again, and again. She adjusted for wind with nothing but instinct, reading the invisible shifts like someone who had survived by sensing what others couldn't. Frank's eyes narrowed. A man approached the office, eyes wide. "Frank, something's not right." He pointed toward her. "She's hitting steel at distances we don't even qualify for. No spotting scope, no corrections. And she didn't sign in, no ID, no name." Frank's gut tightened. 20 minutes later, 2 local officers showed up, cautious, hands hovering near their holsters. "Ma'am," one said carefully, "we need to see some ID and a weapons permit." She turned toward them without alarm, her palms open, voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We just need your identification," he repeated. She gave a half smile. "Didn't bring any." They searched her gear. No wallet, no phone, just a keycard, blank, unmarked, and a small notebook filled with handwritten numbers and what looked like global coordinates. "You'll need to come with us, ma'am." She didn't resist. Not a word of protest. That more than anything rattled them. As they led her toward the patrol car, Frank caught her gaze drifting toward the horizon, toward the trees, the sky, the distant mountains. Her eyes weren't fearful. They were calculating, as if she was measuring exits, escape routes, or something far beyond. Back at the Coastal Harbor Sheriff's Office, a 3-cell station tucked between a diner and the firehouse, she sat through fingerprinting like a statue, compliant but mute. "Name?" the booking deputy asked. "Nothing." "Address?" Silence. You understand that withholding identification is a crime?" Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken, but no words. Detective Marcus Wells stepped in, a seasoned officer with a talent for reading people and breaking them down. He tried everything: kindness, pressure, federal threats, even subtle references to national security. She offered nothing in return, just quiet, respectful stillness. One deputy chuckled. "What do we got here, huh? CIA? Or maybe Russian intelligence?" "Maybe she's a ghost," another joked. "Trained and dropped in." They laughed nervously, but deep down none of it felt like a joke. When she was finally alone in her cell, something subtle shifted. Her posture relaxed just enough to move without suspicion, but her mind, razor sharp, was already dissecting the space around her. She noted the locations of the surveillance cameras, the timing of the guards' footsteps, the creak in the door hinges. Through the narrow, barred window she studied the building's layout. Marked exit signs, guard booths, the placement of fire extinguishers. Every detail mattered. She was mapping more than escape. She was calculating control. Detective Marcus Wells returned with news. No records, nothing in state or local databases, not even a parking ticket. The sheriff, frustrated but intrigued, suggested they try the federal system. The tech team shrugged. "System's down. We can try again tomorrow." That evening, a young patrol officer brought her a paper cup of water. As she reached out, the sleeve of her orange jumpsuit shifted, revealing a faint, inch-long scar at her wrist. Not fresh, not accidental. It was a rope burn, just like the kind you get in fast rope helicopter insertions. The officer blinked. "That's an unusual scar." "Climbing accidents," she said, her voice quiet and controlled, the first words she'd spoken in hours. Later that day, a frazzled public defender arrived, late and clearly overwhelmed. His tie was crooked, his briefcase overstuffed. After 20 minutes of trying to break her silence, he gave up. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. "Now they're talking terrorism, and that rifle you were using, it doesn't exist on any registry." The next morning came fast. She was escorted into the courthouse in shackles, wearing the same orange jumpsuit, her hair tied back simply, her gaze steady. She didn't walk like someone accused of a federal crime. She walked like someone on her way to a meeting. Calm, contained, and perfectly still inside. As they passed the harbor, she caught a glimpse of the open sea. A naval vessel rested quietly offshore, gray and unmoving. For the briefest moment, her expression softened, something between recognition and relief. The courthouse in Coastal Port was built in 1887, its antique woodwork and iron details speaking of another time. But today it buzzed with present-day tension. Reporters from Portland, curious townsfolk, and men in unmarked black suits filled every corner of the room. Judge Eleanor Harmon was clearly irritated as she reviewed the case file. At the defense table, the woman sat silently beside her public defender, who looked more like a temp at the DMV than a lawyer ready for federal court. "Your Honor," the defender said, half standing, "I'm requesting a continuance. My client won't cooperate, and I've had no time to prepare a full defense." From the back of the room, a man in a dark suit stood. "Judge, I'm Agent Thomas from Homeland Security. We're requesting immediate federal custody of the defendant pending an investigation into national security threats." Before Judge Harmon could respond, another voice rose. "The FBI has jurisdiction here, Your Honor." Another suit stepped forward, this one with a badge clipped discreetly inside his coat. "We believe this woman is connected to an ongoing federal case." Judge Harmon slammed her gavel. "This is still my courtroom," she said sharply. "We'll proceed with the arraignment, then we'll deal with who gets to claim her." The court clerk read the charges aloud. Illegal possession of an unregistered firearm, failure to identify to law enforcement, and suspicion of terrorist affiliations. Through it all, the woman's gaze remained fixed. She didn't flinch. Her posture was flawless. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was the stillness of someone who already knew the ending. Detective Wells, seated in the front row, couldn't take his eyes off her. She didn't fit any profile he'd ever studied. Not a terrorist, not mentally ill, not a criminal. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Harmon asked. Before the public defender could stammer through a response, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open. Everyone turned. A Navy admiral in full dress uniform entered, his polished shoes echoing through the room like cannon fire. His ribbons shimmered under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. 2 officers flanked him, equally sharp in appearance. Without waiting for acknowledgement, the admiral walked directly down the aisle. Every veteran in the room rose instinctively. Even Judge Harmon stood as he approached the bench and handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. The room fell into a stunned hush as the judge broke the seal and read. Her brow furrowed, her mouth slightly opened. The irritation drained from her face, replaced first by surprise, then recognition, and finally reverence. When she looked up again, her voice was soft but sure. "This is an official order from the Department of Defense. All charges against the defendant are to be dropped immediately. This case is reclassified under national security clearance." She struck the gavel. "Proceedings postponed." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd as the admiral approached the woman. The officer beside him swiftly unlocked her cuffs. She stood, dignified and composed. "I apologize for the disruption," she said quietly. The admiral gave a subtle nod, then spoke loud enough for all to hear. "On the contrary, Commander, the Navy owes you an apology." Silence fell again. Then slowly, like a tide coming in, every uniformed officer, every soldier present, even Agent Thomas and his associates, rose in respect. Some saluted. Others bowed their heads. No one dared speak. The mystery hadn't been solved, but the room understood one thing without question. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone whose name didn't need to be spoken, because in certain circles it already was. Detective Marcus Wells stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with realization. The quiet woman who had refused to answer a single question just hours ago was gone. In her place now stood Commander Hayes. Shoulders squared, spine straight, exuding the authority of someone who had faced far greater trials than any courtroom. She no longer tried to disappear. She no longer needed to. The quiet soldier now radiated a presence that made even the admiral beside her seem like an equal, not a superior. Judge Harmon, herself a former Judge Advocate General, rose to her feet, offering a nod of solemn respect to both of them. "Thank you for your understanding, Admiral," she said. The admiral returned the nod. Commander Hayes was acting under classified directives. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was duty. Outside, the courthouse was swarming with reporters, their microphones pointed like weapons, questions flying into the air. Cameras flashed as the black government SUV pulled to the curb. Commander Hayes, now in crisp civilian clothes provided by the Navy, stood beside the admiral, her posture as composed as ever. Sheriff Daniels approached, torn between duty and deference. "Admiral, with all due respect, my department treated this like a potential terrorist case. We deserve an explanation." The admiral's tone was calm but firm. "Sheriff, your team acted appropriately under the circumstances, but I assure you, Commander Hayes is one of the Navy's most decorated operators. She poses no threat to your community. Quite the opposite. This community owes her more than it knows." Detective Wells stepped forward, his voice low. "Commander, I owe you an apology." For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. No longer guarded, no longer blank. Her gaze was warm, resolute. "No need to apologize, Detective. You did your job." Then, an elderly man in a faded VFW cap shuffled forward, his steps careful, his presence humble. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I was a Navy corpsman, Desert Storm. I sat in that courtroom all morning and I knew there was something familiar about the way you carried yourself." He extended a weathered hand. "Thank you for your service, whatever it is you do." She shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for yours." The admiral checked his watch. Commander Hayes, we need to proceed. Operation Silent Harbor requires final briefing. Washington is expecting your report. The name hit Sheriff Daniels like a lightning bolt. Silent Harbor? He echoed. The counter-terror operation that stopped the port attack last fall? The Admiral neither confirmed nor denied it. Commander Hayes has served this country for 12 years with distinction. Most of it will never be public. A reporter surged forward. Commander, will you make a statement? She turned calmly. No comment. And I ask for privacy. As she and the Admiral moved toward the waiting vehicle, something remarkable happened. Officers from multiple agencies, those who had cuffed her, questioned her, doubted her, stood in a silent line. Not a wall, a corridor of honor. They stood at attention, heads bowed, some even saluting. As she passed through, the truth hit Wells like a wave. She'd never been hiding guilt. She had been trained to hide brilliance. And for the first time in years, she was finally allowed to walk in her own shadow. That evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, Frank Holden swept the shooting range. The fog had lifted. The lanes were still, except for the faint echo of distant birds and the rustle of wind through the evergreens. He was just about to close up when a black SUV pulled in and parked. Commander Hayes stepped out alone. No longer disguised, no longer small. Her movements were smooth, lethal, and unapologetically precise. I came to pick up my equipment, she said, her voice quiet but certain. Frank nodded, motioning her toward the office. Sheriff had it shipped back this afternoon, special courier, signed and sealed. He handed her a locked safety case. She checked the contents with the familiarity of someone who had assembled the same tools under duress in places no one would ever see on a map. Frank hesitated, then cleared his throat. Submarines, 20 years in the Navy. I know the weight of silence. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time all day, she smiled. Small, genuine. Then you also know the value of loyalty. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. She turned to leave. Take care of yourself, Commander. They already do, she said, without turning around. And then she disappeared into the dusk, like fog over the water, like stories never told, like heroes who never asked to be seen. There's nothing fussy about you, Frank said, leaning against the office doorway as dusk fell, but I think there's more to you than you let on. Commander Hayes offered a quiet smile. Most people only see what they expect to see. Frank nodded toward the rifle case. That's not a standard model. I've been around long enough to know that. She didn't deny it. No, it's not. Without hesitation, she unpacked the weapon with effortless precision. Each piece clicked into place like choreography. Then she walked, silent and steady, to the farthest shooting lane, just like before. No scope, no warm-up, just the whisper of metal as she took aim in the dimming light. The shot came, soft, surgical. Through his binoculars, Frank saw the impossible. A perfect bullseye on a barely visible target. She reassembled the rifle and locked it into its case with the same care as a surgeon packing away instruments. I appreciate your discretion, she said, looking back over her shoulder. You could have stepped in. You saw more than anyone else. Frank gave a small shrug. Wasn't my place. But I did make a call. After they picked you up, I reached out to someone, an old Navy buddy. Works out of the Pentagon now. She paused, understanding flickering in her eyes. Thank you. Will you be coming back? He asked as she approached her car. Commander Hayes looked out over the harbor, where the silhouettes of distant ships moved like shadows over water. Some of us are always around, she replied softly. You just don't see us. And with that, she was gone. Her tail lights dissolved into the night, leaving only silence and the memory of someone extraordinary. 2 weeks later, Detective Wells was seated at his cluttered desk, flipping through the remnants of a case that had no proper ending. No charges, no fingerprints, no standard protocol. Just a ghost who had walked into their world and rewritten the rules. His phone rang. Detective Wells? He answered. A familiar voice replied, crisp and authoritative. Detective, this is Admiral Wilson. We met briefly during the matter involving Commander Hayes. Wells sat up. Yes, sir. How can I help you? I'm calling with an invitation. Commander Hayes is receiving a commendation tomorrow at the Norfolk Naval Base. She specifically asked that you attend. Wells blinked. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm confused. I arrested her. The Admiral chuckled gently. Sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who leave us with the most valuable lessons. He paused, then added, The ceremony is private, but we can arrange clearance. The next morning, Detective Marcus Wells drove south. The sun hung low in the sky, golden against the asphalt as he passed through a series of military checkpoints. At the final gate, a young Marine saluted and led him through a maze of corridors to a small auditorium tucked away behind the main hangars. Inside it was silent. No press, no photographers, just a handful of high-ranking officers, a folded flag on display, and a podium bearing the Navy crest. And there, in full uniform, stood Commander Hayes. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't emotional, but there was peace in her eyes, a quiet pride that came from knowing who she was and what she had survived. When the Admiral stepped forward to speak, he didn't list her missions. He didn't describe her victories. Instead, he said, True service isn't about glory, it's about sacrifice and courage in silence. As she accepted the commendation, Wells finally understood. She had never needed recognition. She just needed to be seen. And now, at last, she was. The audience was small, no more than 50, mostly senior officers, some in crisp uniforms, others in plain clothes that did little to hide their military bearing. No cameras, no media, no applause, just quiet reverence. Detective Wells took a seat in the back row, unsure if he belonged there at all. Admiral Wilson stepped up to the podium. His voice was clear and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to honor Commander Alexandra Hayes for her extraordinary service during Operation Silent Harbor. He paused. Due to the classified nature of her mission, I can only reveal that Commander Hayes spent 11 months embedded in covert operations. Her objective, to identify and neutralize a significant threat to national security. Wells watched her rise from her seat, dressed in formal navy blues, ribbons and citations neatly arranged across her chest. She walked with quiet command, far from the modest woman in faded jeans he once arrested. The Admiral continued, Commander Hayes is one of our top specialists in counterterrorism and unconventional warfare. A graduate at the top of her class in Coronado, she went on to become one of the first women ever cleared for the Navy's Special Warfare Development Group. That detail remains, of course, officially unconfirmed. Wells leaned forward, the weight of realization pressing against him. She had walked into his town like a ghost. Now he understood. He'd tried to contain a storm he couldn't even see. During Operation Silent Harbor, Admiral Wilson said, Commander Hayes eliminated 16 confirmed hostile actors while maintaining full operational cover. Her actions directly prevented coordinated attacks on 3 East Coast ports. Had those attacks succeeded, the cost in lives would have been catastrophic. Then he turned to her, his voice softening. When her cover was nearly blown, she chose not to break character. She accepted detainment by local law enforcement rather than risk the mission. That level of discipline, of sacrifice, is rare. Wells swallowed hard. She had never been a suspect. She had been a guardian. Commander Hayes nodded toward him. Her eyes held no resentment, only quiet respect. After the ceremony, Wells hesitated near the exit, but then he gathered the courage to approach. Commander Hayes, he said, clearing his throat, congratulations, and thank you. She extended her hand. Thank you for coming, Detective. I owe you an apology for everything that happened. She shook her head. It's not necessary. You did exactly what you were trained to do, based on the information you had. Her voice was calm, measured, sincere. In fact, she added with a faint smile, your thoroughness was impressive. Most people would have been satisfied with a warning about range regulations. You asked questions. That saved lives. Wells shifted awkwardly. If I may ask, why let yourself be arrested? Why not pull rank in private? She glanced around, then motioned him toward a quieter corner. The operation wasn't over, she said, lowering her voice. My cover identity still needed to hold, even under scrutiny. The individuals we were tracking had access to law enforcement channels. If word had spread that I received special treatment or that I was military, those 11 months would have been compromised. She paused. Sometimes, the best way to protect your mission is to fully commit to the illusion, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Wells blinked. So you just let it happen. I did, she nodded, and I also knew Admiral Wilson would step in before things got too far. Just then, another officer approached, signaling it was time for her to move on. It was good to meet you, Detective, she said with a final handshake. Keep doing what you do. And then she was gone, gliding across the room like a tide that had done its work and knew when to recede. Admiral Wilson stepped beside Wells, hands folded behind his back. She's something, isn't she? Wells nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I've never met anyone like her. Few have, the Admiral said, his eyes following her figure as she disappeared into the hallway. And fewer still understand what it costs to be her. Detective, Admiral Wilson had said with a quiet smile that day, we're always looking for people with your kind of attention to detail and perseverance. If you've ever considered a career change, call my office. 6 months later, Marcus Wells stood on the deck of a naval vessel, watching the coastline of Maine fade into a misty blur behind him. 13 years with the Coastal Port Police Department had led him here, into the fold of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. His first assignment? Serve as liaison between local law enforcement and the Navy's Eastern Seaboard Task Force. It was a role built for someone who'd walked in both worlds. His phone buzzed. Unlisted number. Some of us are always around here, welcome aboard. He smiled. Those were her words, Commander Hayes's words, spoken months ago at that quiet little shooting range. He hadn't seen her since the ceremony at Norfolk, and he doubted he ever would again. People like her didn't linger in plain sight. They moved in silence, protected others from shadows they themselves had to walk through. But now, he was part of their support, building the systems that would shield those silent heroes. He was reading through a brief when the ship's captain approached. We've received a report about unusual activity at a private shooting range near our next port. Thought you might want to take a look. Wells nodded. Yes, sir. I'll look into it right away. He opened the preliminary report and almost laughed. A woman of unremarkable appearance, firing at targets no one else could see, let alone hit. Some things never change. Months passed. Wells found his rhythm in the NCIS, refining new protocols for civilian encounters, training departments up and down the coast. His experience with Commander Hayes became part of the new standard, passed from precinct to precinct like a story no one could publish but everyone knew mattered. Then, one stormy night, long after most had gone home, someone knocked at his office door. Commander Hayes, wearing jeans, a gray jacket, and the same unassuming presence. Detective, she said with a nod. He smiled. Agent now, he corrected, gesturing her inside. I didn't expect to see you again. The plan changed, she replied, sitting across from him. I hear you've been developing new field identification protocols. I have. Helps prevent misunderstandings. She studied him closely. Your work hasn't gone unnoticed, she said, which is why I'm here. She slid a sealed folder onto his desk. We need someone who understands both sides of military operations and civilian law enforcement. Someone who can navigate the gray between the lines. He opened the folder. His eyes scanned the words. Joint Task Force, Domestic International Threat Coordination. Clearance. Top secret. Admiral Wilson's signature was at the bottom. Wells looked up slowly. Why me? Hayes didn't hesitate. Because when you arrested me, you did your job. You put duty above instinct, and then, when you learned the truth, you didn't look away. That balance is rare. Wells sat back, stunned. 6 months ago, he'd been a small-town detective. Now he was being recruited into a war no one ever talked about. "Where do we start?" he asked. She stood. "We already have. Meet me tomorrow at 6, the same range where we first met." He grinned. "This time, let's skip the handcuffs." She turned without answering, but the corner of her mouth curled upward, a silent agreement between two people who understood one another now in a way few ever would. The next morning, long before sunrise, Frank arrived at the shooting range, as he had for the past 15 years. But this time the lights inside the main building were already on. "Hello," he called, instinctively resting a hand on the pistol holstered beneath his coat. A calm voice answered. "It's just me, Frank." Commander Hayes sat at his desk, quietly reviewing what looked like satellite images. Her tone was focused, efficient. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Frank said with a chuckle. "What's it been, 8 months?" "9, she corrected, "and this isn't exactly a social visit." Frank nodded. "Wells called yesterday, told me to expect guests." "Helig learns quickly," she said with a smirk. "We'll need exclusive use of the range for the next 72 hours. Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's a tall order during hunting season." "I know," she replied. "That's why this comes with a classified clearance requirement." She handed him a sealed envelope. Frank didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just nodded. "Same targets?" he asked. "No," she said, glancing at the still dark horizon. "This time the targets move." If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. Some missions never make the headlines. Some heroes never wear their medals in public. But behind every successful operation there are people like Commander Hayes who walk the line between silence and sacrifice, and people like Marcus Wells who choose responsibility over recognition. And sometimes, if you're paying close enough attention, you realize they've been around you all along. Is hidden in plain sight. She slid an envelope across the desk without a word. Frank glanced inside and saw a check, enough zeros to keep the range running for 6 months. His eyes widened, but he didn't reach for it. "That's very generous," he said quietly. "But you know, I'd have said yes anyway." Commander Hayes offered a small, appreciative smile. "We still do things the right way, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching." Within the next few hours, vehicles began arriving. Unmarked SUVs, communications trucks disguised as cable service vans, and dozens of men and women dressed in nondescript clothing. Yet they moved with deliberate precision, trained, aware, and invisible to anyone not looking closely. By noon, the sleepy shooting range had transformed into a tactical command post. Maps covered every inch of wall space. Surveillance equipment filled Frank's office. The firing lines had been repurposed into briefing zones and gear staging points. Agent Wells arrived with a case of field equipment from the NCIS outpost. Frank met him with a handshake. "Thanks for accommodating all this," Wells said. "When the country calls, you don't say no," Frank replied. "Besides, Commander Hayes doesn't exactly have to twist arms." Wells chuckled. "She really does." Commander Hayes gathered the full team under the largest shelter. "For those just arriving, intel confirms an active threat operating within 50 miles of this location," she began, pointing to a map. "We believe an operation is imminent within the next 48 hours. She tapped 3 zones marked in red. 3 possible staging sites, 2 residential, 1 commercial. We need to confirm the target without alerting them to our presence." Wells studied the locations. "All civilian. We can't just storm them." "Exactly," she nodded. "That's why we need your judgment, Wells. We must maintain the firewall between military oversight and civilian jurisdiction." Over the next 24 hours, the operation unfolded with chilling efficiency. Surveillance teams rotated in shifts, drones mapped heat signatures, analysts intercepted encrypted chatter. Wells coordinated with local departments, crafting carefully worded cover stories to conceal the true mission. Frank watched in awe. These weren't soldiers or police in any traditional sense. They operated with minimal words, silent gestures, and complete trust in one another, like ghosts who happened to bleed. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A surveillance unit intercepted encrypted communications from an abandoned riverside warehouse, owned on paper by a non-existent import company. A tech analyst turned to Hayes. Thermal confirms at least 8 individuals, high probability of weapons trafficking. Hayes reviewed the live feed, then turned to Wells. This is where we shift jurisdiction. Wells nodded. I'll activate the local tactical response. They'll need a briefing. Keep it minimal, she instructed. Say it's foreign-trained operatives planning a domestic attack. No details on our involvement, no unit names, no origin. As Wells moved to coordinate the teams, Hayes turned to Frank. One more favor? Name it, he said without hesitation. When this wraps up, certain details, equipment, personnel, activities, will need to disappear. Frank smiled. Commander, I kept Navy secrets for 20 years. Some habits don't die easy. She paused, reading him. Then she nodded. That's why we came here first. Well, he said, you chose the right place. Just before dawn, local tactical units surrounded the warehouse, with Commander Hayes' team stationed nearby in overwatch positions, ready but invisible. The raid went off without a hitch. 8 arrests, a weapons cache, documents that would keep federal analysts busy for months. But when the press arrived, the statement was sterile. A successful operation based on anonymous federal intelligence. By mid-afternoon, the task force had vanished. No uniforms, no flags, no sign they were ever there. Just silence. Frank quietly began resetting the range, returning targets to their original places. Wells helped him carry out equipment. Thanks, he said simply. For what? Frank asked. Wells smiled. According to the news, you and I had nothing to do with this. Exactly. As the last car prepared to leave, Hayes returned to say goodbye. This place, she said, looking around the quiet range, seems to sit at the crossroads of interesting events. It's just a place where people come to train, Frank replied. Some just happen to be better trained than others. She handed him a plain white business card, only a number printed in fine black ink. If you ever spot someone with uncommon skills, call this. It'll route to people who care. Recruitment? Always, she said with a nod. The right people are hard to find, and harder to see. She turned to go, but Frank called after her. Commander, was any of it real? The arrest, the courtroom, or was it all a setup? She paused, then looked over her shoulder with a glint of amusement. What do you think? Frank considered for a long moment. I think sometimes the story's real, and sometimes the cover story becomes the only part the world's allowed to remember. She smiled, faint and fleeting, and walked into the fog just as the morning sun began to rise behind her. The most effective way to hide, Commander Hayes once told Frank, is in plain sight. Create a scene people remember, for all the wrong reasons. It was the first time she ever smiled at him, really smiled. You could have been a great operative, Frank. He chuckled. I'm happy just keeping the range running. Someone needs to be here when people like you need a quiet place to train. 6 months passed. One overcast morning, Frank noticed a young woman, early 20s, unassuming, quiet, but with a rifle technique too precise to be casual. Nothing flashy, but her timing, posture, and breath control, flawless. When she adjusted for a crosswind without consulting any instrument, Frank felt a familiar chill. Hayes had done the exact same thing. He watched her for an hour. She didn't rush, didn't fumble. Each shot at a different range. Each result logged into a small, well-worn notebook. When she finally packed up, Frank approached her casually. Impressive grouping. Thank you, she said politely. I practice when I can. Military background, he asked gently. University shooting team, she replied. A plausible cover, hard to verify, easy to accept. Frank nodded, offering a warm, non-committal smile. You're always welcome here. We get all kinds of skill levels. But as she packed her gear, Frank noticed the smooth, unbroken sequence of motion, the same rhythm, the same discipline, the same calm detachment Hayes and her team carried. It was muscle memory, and it didn't come from college. That evening, after locking up, Frank pulled out the old white business card from his wallet. The number was still there, no name, no logo, just a line connecting him to shadows. He dialed. A neutral voice answered. "Identify and proceed." Frank took a breath. "The calm horizon of the blue water," he said. The phrase Agent Wells had taught him. Continue. "I met someone today. A young woman, 20-something, excellent shot, professional form, gave a cover story, college team. But her wind compensation? It was instinctive." A pause on the other end. Then, "Assessment? She's either one of yours testing me or someone you should keep your eye on. We'll take a look. Anything else?" Frank hesitated. "Is Commander Hayes still active?" Another pause, longer this time. "That name is not currently in our activity database." Frank understood the message, and the omission. "Of course," he said, "just curious. Your contribution is recognized and appreciated." 3 days later, the young woman returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A middle-aged man accompanied her, plain clothes, calm, with the confidence of someone used to making decisions in high-stakes rooms. They trained side by side, their rhythm seamless. It was student and mentor, but more than that, it was a test. When they finished, the man approached Frank as the woman packed the gear. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, using Frank's surname, though Frank had never offered it. "I understand you called in recently." Frank nodded, cool and composed. "I did." "Good eyes," the man said. "She's a review candidate. This range was part of her evaluation, to operate unnoticed." "She's skilled," Frank replied. "But you spotted her," the man said. "That's what makes this place valuable. Sometimes talent spots talent better than any algorithm." The young woman joined them. "How did I do?" she asked, breaking cover with ease. The man answered. "Mr. Sullivan identified you within the hour. You'll need to mask your training patterns better." She nodded, unfazed. "What gave me away?" "The wind correction," Frank said. "Commander Hayes used to do the same." Both the man and the young woman exchanged a glance at the mention of Hayes. "Thanks for the feedback," she said. "Can I keep coming back?" Frank smiled. "Of course. Just miss a few more shots if you're trying to blend in." As they prepared to leave, the man handed Frank a sealed envelope. Inside, another business card, this one embossed with a floating insignia he recognized, Naval Special Warfare. Below it were secure contact numbers. "We're always looking for trusted sites," the man said, "and trusted observers. If you're open to a more formal arrangement." And Frank didn't answer right away. 15 years running this range had taught him that sometimes the most valuable work happens far from the spotlight. "Maybe it's time for something new," he finally said. The man smiled. "Commander Hayes always appreciated your situational awareness. That's rare and useful." As the two operatives walked away, Frank watched them with a quiet sense of clarity. This wasn't just a range anymore. It was a checkpoint in a network most people would never know existed. That night, Frank tucked the new card into his wallet. Right next to the first one, he thought about Hayes, about Wells, about the young woman who still had everything ahead of her. Some wear the uniform in public. Others serve in silence. And then there are those like Frank, stationed in quiet corners of the country, making sure those shadows remain safe enough to do what needs to be done. The next morning, Frank arrived early as usual. On his desk sat a package, sealed tight. Inside, a high-grade scope with integrated thermal imaging and an encrypted comms module. A small note was taped to the top. Just 3 words. "Keep watching, Frank." The handwriting was unmistakable. Commander Hayes. She may have moved on, to new missions, new names, new wars, but her presence lingered. Her legacy lived on in that little piece of Maine where ordinary-looking people with extraordinary skills still found a place to train without question. And Frank? He no longer just managed a shooting range. He guarded a sanctuary for the unseen. And when the next stranger showed up, too quiet, too skilled, too careful, he'd be ready. Because some of them are always around. You just have to know how to look. A range beyond the fog. Frank Sullivan stood alone at the far end of the shooting range, the crisp morning air brushing past his cheeks like memory itself. The grass was still wet with dew, and the mist that drifted in from the harbor made the world feel softer somehow, blurred at the edges, as if the sharpness of reality had been dialed down for just a moment of peace. In the distance, the sun rose with slow, deliberate grace, casting a golden sheen across the targets lined up in silent rows. He adjusted the new thermal scope that had arrived just days earlier, its sleek design and encrypted interface still foreign to his hands but increasingly familiar. The note that had come with it, "Keep watching, Frank," was tucked safely into the drawer of his desk, right beside the 2 cards he kept like talismans. He hadn't heard from Commander Hayes again, but he hadn't expected to. People like her didn't say goodbye. They moved forward, slipping through the cracks of conventional life, weaving threads of protection through society's fabric without anyone knowing. And yet their presence lingered, like ripples in water long after the stone had sunk beneath the surface. Frank breathed in the salt-kissed air and closed his eyes for a moment. What had started as a retirement hobby, a way to stay connected to his Navy past without venturing too far from home, had become something else entirely. The shooting range was no longer just a place to practice marksmanship. It had become a silent threshold, a checkpoint for the unseen, a refuge for those who carried burdens too heavy for civilian life and too secret to be shared. He thought often about Wells, now several months into his new role, a man once bound to the rules of badge and jurisdiction, now navigating a world painted in grays instead of black and white, and of the young woman who had triggered it all. The new recruit whose posture had given her away despite her practiced cover. She had returned several times since then, each time more composed, more deliberate, more confident. Frank had never asked her name. He didn't need to. The world, he realized, wasn't divided between heroes and everyone else. Most people didn't wear capes or medals or carry rifles with laser-straight barrels. They were mothers quietly raising their kids right. Clerks who smiled a little longer at checkout counters, teachers who stayed late for one student struggling with long division. The stories didn't make the evening news, but they stitched the world together just the same. The people who came through this range, those who were truly exceptional, shared one thing in common: restraint. Not one of them boasted, not one ever asked to be seen. They came to improve, to stay sharp, to be ready. But most of all, they came because they knew that goodness wasn't a performance, it was a discipline. It was what you chose to do when nobody was watching, and especially when no one would ever thank you for it. Frank thought about that a lot. One afternoon in late spring, he sat with a sandwich and a thermos of black coffee at the wooden bench near Lane 3. A local kid, probably no older than 18, was missing every shot, then laughing and high-fiving his friend anyway. They weren't great marksmen, but their joy was real. Frank watched them and smiled. When they finished, one of them approached. "Sir, you run this place, right?" "That's right." "Thanks for letting us shoot. We're not exactly Navy material," the boy said, grinning. Frank chuckled. "Doesn't matter. Out here, everyone trains. Skill comes later, respect comes first." The boy nodded, thinking more deeply than expected. Before leaving, the teen glanced back and asked, "You ever meet anyone famous here?" Frank paused, then gave a small smile. "No one you'd recognize, but I've met some people who've done a lot of good." That was enough. In his quieter moments, Frank would think about Commander Hayes and what she represented. Not just discipline or service or even excellence. She represented a certain moral clarity that came not from dogma but from years of hard choices. She had chosen to keep silent when it would have been easier to explain. She had accepted detainment to protect strangers who would never know her name. She had trusted that right would outlast recognition. That kind of goodness was a quiet thing, but it endured. It made Frank believe, more than ever, in the power of the unseen gesture. The stranger who pays for the groceries of the woman fumbling for change, the neighbor who mows both yards without saying a word, The officer who holds back anger when suspicion clouds judgment, choosing professionalism over pride. These were the kind of people Frank was now helping to find, nurture, and protect. Sometimes, in the twilight hour, he would walk the range after everyone else had gone. The targets would still be standing, holes punched through them like constellations waiting to be named. The wind would rustle the flags just slightly, and he would feel, more than hear, the presence of those who had stood in those lanes before, testing their aim, refining their silence, readying themselves for a world that rarely understood their worth. He never felt alone then, because some part of him understood now that watching was not passive. It was a form of service. By tending to this small plot of earth, by keeping the rules clear, the boundaries honest, and the silence respectful, Frank was upholding a trust. He was the sentry at the outer gate. He was the first test, and sometimes the final reprieve. There is dignity in ordinary things. In a clean-swept lane, a safe place to miss your shot and try again. A nod from an old Navy man who sees more than he lets on. Frank knew that no one would ever build a monument for the shooting range off Route 17. It wouldn't be featured in any documentaries or history books. But every so often a woman with military stillness would walk through his gate. A man with steady hands would pay in cash and ask for a quiet hour. And he would know. This was the place. The safe place. One morning, Frank arrived to find a small envelope resting on his desk. No postage. No signature. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a nondescript room filled with whiteboards, maps, encrypted laptops, and Commander Hayes, standing beside Agent Wells. Both of them faced the camera, neither smiling, but their eyes full of clarity. Tucked into the edge of the photo was a folded paper. 3 words. "Still watching, Frank?" He exhaled slowly, carefully folding the photo and placing it next to the others. It was never just about surveillance. It was about connection. In the end, Frank understood this. The world doesn't need grand gestures to stay upright. It just needs more people doing their part quietly, faithfully, and with grace. And maybe that's what Commander Hayes had meant all along. Not everyone has to hold the line, but someone must hold the gate. So he stayed. Not because he had to, but because he could. And as long as the fog rolled in from the harbor and young people still came to test their aim against the wind, Frank would be there, watching, guiding, not judging, because there's a special kind of strength in choosing to remain ordinary when you know how rare that choice really is. The range beyond the fog was never just a field with targets. It had become something sacred, a sanctuary for decency, a place where courage met humility, and where, in the silence between gunshots, the world's defenders could practice not only their aim, but their humanity. And somewhere, in the wind, if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear her voice. "Keep watching, Frank." And he would, every day. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard.